So I'm very happy to be introducing Andreas Buchwaldt as our speaker today. Andreas is a Danish-born Saskatoon-based artist working across a range of media including kinetic, sculpture, sound, video, and dance. His practice explores ways of reimagining the built environment and interpersonal communication through materiality. This research is partly inspired by the hypothetical space of science fiction. Andreas holds an MFA from York University in Toronto and a BFA from the University of Saskatchewan. His work, Growing on You, a kinetic sound installation, is currently on view at Whippersnapper Gallery in Toronto until October 27th. It was part of the Nuit Blanche exhibitions on October 1st. And I should mention that if you go to Whippersnapper, it's open Thursdays. That's what I made a mistake. Yeah. Thursdays to Saturdays, 1 o'clock to 5 o'clock.
7 o'clock.
7 o'clock. Oh, okay. That actually.
That might help things.
Okay. Yes. And so Andreas has exhibited his work at Art Mur in Montreal, Eastern Edge in St.John, Struts in Sackville, New Brunswick, Neutral Ground in Regina, and AKA in Saskatoon. Before relocating to Saskatoon, Andreas was the Sculpture Facilitator at the Banff Centre, so maybe some of the professors might have been to Banff and might have met Andreas. So yes, please welcome Andreas for me.
Hi guys, well thank you for having me. I guess I don't need to introduce myself, so this is kind of like a general kind of survey of my work that I've made kind of just a little bit in grad school and then over the past 4 or 5 years. Yeah, so I'm in that awkward stage of like I'm not quite an emerging artist, I'm not quite a mid-career artist, I'm kind of falling in between. So I hope there's something to offer all the students in the crowd because I'm not that far removed from where you guys are now. And yeah, hopefully I can give the faculty something to chew on as well. Yeah, so I just, like the way I give artist talks, I just throw out ideas. I don't really like polish them up and finish them for you. I'm just gonna toss them out there, little sentences that might not make sense. We'll just see where we get to. The things I'm gonna talk about, like architecture, the built environment, urban planning, this idea of science fiction and time travel and raising the dead, the machine, automation, and artificial intelligence, a little bit, the body and prosthetics, and just talking a little bit about like having a multidisciplinary practice. So like Louise mentioned, I'm working with like music and dance and art, computer programming and performance, a bit of theater. Yeah, so got lots of things to cover. Yeah, so that's my name, that's my website. This will pop up at the end if you guys are curious about checking out more or rewatching some of the stuff you've seen today. So just to begin, my thesis project at York University was based in looking at the language of architecture, essentially like the planning phase of architecture, so architectural models and diagrams and blueprints and things like that, and then using the machine and kinetic art as a way to kind of intervene on that kind of language and to bring in a new dialogue. Because if there's anything that needs, imagining or reimagining or a critical viewpoint into, it's the way we design our cities, specifically Toronto, because everywhere has problems, but we have our own set. So my kind of focal point was this idea of flexible architecture. Like how can you, when you're planning a structure, kind of open it up, and how can you imagine it as something that can be changed on the fly, or something that's, what's that word? Anyway, we'll get there. So this is a white silk screen on a blue piece of spandex strung to 4 motorized arms, and then computer programmed to kind of stretch and change its orientation in space. The blue, it's from the blueprint aesthetic, obviously, of old planning. They don't really use this aesthetic anymore. But also the blue for me kind of represents the kind of infinitely digital, like the space of a computer that can go on forever. So this is the drawing itself, kind of this kind of split level architecture that you see in Toronto. I'm interested in these spaces because they are actually quite flexible and they've been around forever, and people keep changing their uses via, like, if it's either a residence or a business on the bottom, and the businesses keep changing and the occupants on the top keep changing. I just think it's an interesting space. I come from Saskatoon, kind of a suburban mentality, and we don't really have this thinking a lot playing out. We usually have our suburbs, and then we have our business zones and our industrial zones, and they're not merging very often. So when I lived in Toronto, although a lot of people may take this for granted, it wasn't a shock, but it was something different. It really made me focus on it. So this is the work. I'll just play the clip for you. Okay. So alongside this kind of research I was doing with the model, I was looking at past examples of, architectural failures. The main one that comes up a lot is this idea of Pruitt-Igoe. I'm not going to really unpack this whole, it's a long history, a lot of different viewpoints, a lot of different papers have been published on it. Essentially, it was a housing project in St. Louis, and then the main cause of its failure was like rampant racism and the building wasn't upkept properly. And the entire housing complex failed. Like, this is just one of, I think it was 14 of these places that was demolished. Maybe not even 20 years after they were built. Like, it's just kind of an abomination of what these things were. So looking at this as like a focal point and then trying to expand that into like a larger, more generalized art piece or art dialogue. Also looking at the idea of 9/11 and our fascination with watching things implode, or not implode, well, I guess being destroyed. And also taking this idea and working it into the idea of the architectural model as the basis for all of these ideas. So this is it's a very clean structure made from these just flexible plastic sheeting and foam pillars, and you kind of have this grid work of a building. And then I used motors to pull it down to kind of simulate an implosion. And then they would release the tension on the motor, and then the building would rise up. And in the gallery, you could watch it rise up and down. So there it is in a depressed state. And we can just quickly watch this. Is that going? No, that's good. So I think with this work, we can talk a little bit about the idea of time travel and about how technologies can allow us to replay an event and rewind it and watch it in reverse. I think there's a kind of a desire when looking at this work, or for me making this work, to maybe like going back to a previous state, to maybe we can fix the problems then before they play out in the future. But then there's also this idea that like all we want to do as the non-critical part of ourselves is just to watch these demolitions over and over again. There's some kind of fascination with that morbid fascination. Like a funny little anecdote that I didn't really intend, but there's kind of a transition from modernist architecture to postmodernist architecture as it crumples, and you kind of end in this, it's almost like you're watching history, aesthetic history play out in the work. Just some, the guts of it underneath, just kind of how rough it can be when I'm first starting to learn how to make machines. As I'm building these machines, this is still in grad school, I'm playing with these mechanisms that I knew from as a child, right? The simple things, because I'm just trying to make these works at the beginning. I just want to keep it simple. So these, you probably know them. You depress the base, the animal collapses. If you add a motor to that, you basically have a structure that's going up and down, just like I was working with before. So I had this idea. I wanted to make kind of a performance with the machine, and I wanted to be part of it. And I kind of wanted to DJ the sculpture. So I set up this Shadowplay Performance. You have these 3 structures that kind of look like buildings when projected, and 3 light sources, so you kind of get this interplay of lights weaving in and out. A little bit of the Plato's Cave idea of watching kind of a false reproduction appearing before you in shadow. But also looking at a lot of Canadian artists working in the time. This is 2012, so like Daniel Barrow and Sherry Boyle were doing a lot of kind of shadow play performances, and I was really interested in that kind of aesthetic based on early Victorian lantern shows. I don't know if you know what that, but just kind of like pre-cinema, pre-theater, just, well, not pre-theater, but it would just be someone standing in front of a light making shadow puppets or having, specialized cutouts, and maybe like these amazing light performances would play out. So we can watch this quickly. That's the structure itself. This is my little control box wired into a briefcase. I'm also controlling a soundtrack, which starts simple and then becomes more frenetic as the action on screen becomes more frenetic. And this is Okay, so just to frame that, that was a part of a performance art festival in Sackville, New Brunswick, shown in an old vaudeville theater. That's kind of these theaters were set up before film. Just kind of small acts would pass through there. Yeah, anyway, that's that. Okay, so that project got me thinking about a number of things, specifically the idea of the machine as a performer in itself that didn't require my actual hands programming it, that maybe it could become an entity in itself, which I could collaborate then with the machine. And this idea of raising the dead that I've kind of talked about rewinding history or going back and then bringing something back from the dead. And so this is a very rough piece. It's never been shown. I just kind of bring it up in artist talks as just like a sketch. But this is my friend Bruce Moncombre. He's a professor at McLuhan University in Edmonton. And he plays the saw. I play the accordion. Both of us suck at it. And but I had a bit of knowledge with Arduino, which essentially is like a little computer that senses the environment and then outputs something. So it can read what our instruments are doing and then control a robot with it. So we had this very simple pile of tubing. There's a light going through it. It's not much, and it's hooked up to the ceiling on a winch motor. And as we play, the thing rises, and as we kind of stop to play or play lower notes, it descends. It doesn't sound like much, but when you put it together in a dark room in a cold studio in Toronto, there's a bit of magic that's created there. So that's his saw. Essentially, his arm is going up and down as he's bending the saw, and it's sensing the distance to the ground, so he can kind of control it a bit like that. And this is my accordion. This little piece here is called a stretch sensor, so you can actually sense how much it's being pulled. And the accordion functions on a pull-push mechanism, so that's how I was sensing my instrument. And then together, we sat in the studio and we did this. Say about that. So essentially, I guess there's that joke that art is either about sex or death, and it just feels like death is like following me around in all these projects. And then the other thing that followed me around from now until like for the past 3 years is the accordion. And just using that mechanism over and over again, this idea of air being compressed and expanded and having air push and pull through accordion reeds, essentially making sound, and just trying to use that mechanism over and over again in different facets. Also exploring different ideas like performance or robotic sculpture. So this next piece, there was a house in northern Toronto, the suburbs of northern Toronto, like Witchwood area. It's a real fancy neighborhood. A bunch of architects, like a conglomeration of architects, bought this beautiful home, but it was more profitable to build a giant condo complex on top of it, so they were going to demolish it. But they also had connections in the art community and asked artists and performance artists and landscape architects and musicians to come and kind of transform the space. So it was like a 2-week mini residency, and then I was invited as well. And so we could select any room in the house, or like somebody dug up the backyard and made these weird bonfire mazes. Someone ripped out all the carpet in the entire house. This was like actually quite mildewy carpet, and then built a disgusting maze in the basement that you could walk in. And it was so dark that you would like come face to face with the dirty, smelly carpet. Incredible. There was like an asthmatic warning on the thing. Like if you had asthma, you should just stay out of there. And I found this room. It was a double room, so you have two rooms on either side. With a walk-through closet in the middle, opposite swinging doors, face-to-face with each other. So this is one of the rooms. This is the other room. I'd say it's a beautiful house, beautiful on the outside. It hadn't been taken care of on the inside. But still, the opinion of all of us was that it probably should not have been destroyed. So there's a kind of a blueprint layout of it. Room 1, room 2, the bellows on either side, those kind of swinging things you can imagine. And so when the piece was done, these 2 giant bellows, that when you pulled the door as you normally would, it would push air through a Soundbox, which is essentially just half of my accordion, the same one you saw in the video before, bolted to the wall. So you could play the accordion. Also a hole cut in the wall, because why not? And it kind of like, you were kind of isolated via like these prison cell framing structures, but you could still see one another. Yeah. So that's from the other room. And then we only had one night to show the work, so it was kind of a nighttime thing. It was open for the public to kind of mess around with, but the kind of highlight of the piece was that we joined up with some of the musicians who had another project going, and we had this kind of improvised sound jam. And because, especially us, we're horrible musicians, it became kind of like this improvised, dissonant sounding, I called it a funeral dirge, and I kind of thought like it was kind of a way to say goodbye to the structure, and it was sad and melancholic, and it was perfect. Yeah. Alongside this piece, I've gained an interest in this idea of improvised sound and like a collaborative approach, which I would take forward to other places. So we can see this performance. So just unpacking this idea of the accordion a little bit more, it's kind of something I fell into, kind of like I don't know, something you can't really explain as an artist, the reason you're attracted to certain things. But then when you try to conceptualize it after, I would just say it was just like, I saw this thing, it breathed like I did. When I played it, it vibrated on my chest, so it was a very bodily feeling of an instrument. And it just felt right, like it's just like the perfect source from which to expand and just explore different things. Yeah, so with all that stuff and relating to the body and this idea of death, I'm like, well, you know, I have a body as well. Like, how can the accordion, how can I get closer to it? There's many iterations of this, and it's kind of funny to see this. Like, this is my first attempt, very clunky, very heavy. So essentially, I'm a walking accordion, basically like a walking version of that project in the house. You can pump my arms, you can play my chest, you can kind of have, we can have a little conversation through this, like, what do you call it, confessional booth style screen in the front. And this was part of a music festival performance, just kind of like we were some artists on the side doing weird things. Is that, okay, oh, sorry. Where did it go? Okay, yeah, basing it on the idea of the diving bell. This kind of protective structure. It was my first time doing performance, and I was a little bit nervous, and I think I subconsciously built this structure for myself to interact with people, but also to give myself some personal space, some distance. And so here's it playing out in the crowded room. Pretty weird. I won't show you the video of this because the documentation is horrible. The sculpture didn't work very well. And it's just weird. It's so awkward watching it. Yeah. But like with any kind of machine building, like basically all art practices, right? It's a prototyping process. So you build one, you learn from it, you build the next, and it's a generative thing. So I was thinking, this isn't good enough. I'm not one with the accordion. I'm just kind of, lugging it around. So let me see if I missed anything here. Yeah. So just like this idea of using the body as a host potentially, and the accordion being like a parasite, or maybe it's a symbiotic relationship. Maybe it's giving something back. I would say it is. Yeah, so taking every major joint in the body, you've got your elbow, shoulder, elbow, armpit, little fart bits, some hip flexors, and the back of your knees, and then your neck. Each of these tubes is like one or two notes, essentially. So as you walk, if you do anything, right, it just translates that motion into perfect sound. It's like a one-to-one thing. So if you skip along at a nice pace, you've got a beat. You've got something ready to go. If you're kind of moving awkwardly, you just have like a mash of things. So there's the back of it, and kind of built with, I just wanted to make it. This is like, what's the fastest way you can make a machine? Is you go to Home Depot, you go to your hardwood stores, and you just get what's off the shelf, right? So I'm using a climbing safety harness, knee braces from Shoppers Drug Mart, tubes for dryer ventilation, and a dust mask, and yeah, that was basically that. It starts to kind of explore this idea of also the prosthetic and enhancing the human body. We can see this playing out in all sorts of fields. You think of like Hollywood, right? We're just obsessed with these kind of superhero movies about these people like us with extended powers that they can do all sorts of things, and what are the possibilities of that, right? But if you're also part of the DIY scene, or you pay attention to that, people are also doing it with their own bodies, and artists are doing it, right? Like they're putting cameras in their heads, or they're tracking their own movements in the world via like GPS, we're tracking our steps. Essentially, that's kind of a prosthetic because it gives you kind of enhanced knowledge of your own life, to know how many steps a day you take, how many calories a day. And just all these things that are being added on top of us. So I think this is kind of a way to kind of jokingly talk about that subject as well. And maybe as art is kind of an illogical reaction to things happening in contemporary society, maybe this is just an illogical prosthetic, something you don't need, but maybe you do need it. Yeah. So let's have a look at that play out. I'm okay with showing this video because it's not me performing, but it's pretty goofy. She got really tired at this point because I just made her do loops. But the sound gets tired as well. Oh. Okay. No, anyway. Okay, so yeah, so after that project, you know, what do you do with that work, right? Of course, you multiply the suit, you make it a bit more flexible, you make it something where the music, I wasn't able to control the music as well as I wanted it to. I wanted to have access to be able to change the notes on the body, and I wanted to construct a narrative because essentially these were costumes for a theatrical production potentially. So yeah, interested in a collaborative approach. A collaborative, essentially, it's my project, right? So I'm like, I own the umbrella term, I own the thing, whatever. But I need help, right? So I'm paying a choreographer, a friend of mine, paying a musician friend of mine to help me kind of understand music theory, and we're working together to kind of make the piece. Yeah. So I don't know if I want to dive into this quite yet, but I will. This idea of science fiction, right, and this idea of like Louis said in that introduction, the hypothetical space, right? So a lot of science fiction narratives play out like, what if the world was like this? How would that in turn play out? And what would you see? How would social dynamics change between people? So I was just trying to take this idea of like, well, so let's just imagine these human beings as a completely different life form. They have these suits. They're making sound based on their movements. Maybe that's a language. Maybe they can talk to each other and they can play out in these narratives, and we're just going to just put them together and see what happens. Yeah, just to throw some names out there, if you guys are science fiction readers, like Ursula Le Guin is a big one for me, Stanislav Lem, the Russian writer, and Philip K. Dick. Just they're kind of old because that's where you get all the old paperbacks. That's the only thing I can really afford to read. Anyway, they're great. Yeah, so let's watch that. So just essentially to kind of explain this a bit better, they're wearing wetsuits. And they are kind of, the pads on them are these sewn-in Velcro discs, and then the tubes are the same tube materials as before. They're wearing ski masks as well on their face, and yeah, so these tubes can be swapped in and out, so like it can, you know, recompose the entire body, which notes are playing where. These guys, friends of mine from Saskatoon, are all a part of this kind of, it's called AcroYoga. I wasn't quite interested in the idea of AcroYoga because it's a weird mishmash of cultural appropriation and weird. Yeah, it's a very weird practice. But they have incredible body strength and all these ways of holding each other and moving around, and I just wanted to take advantage of all of that. So this is my studio, which I painted the floor green, bought a cheap thing curtain, we strung it up, and it's, you know, almost as good as a Hollywood green screen studio. If you guys are interested in that kind of technique, I don't know how many of you are video artists here, not that hard to do. And in the field of art, nobody cares how well you did it. It's just an interesting technique. So doing these kind of hold positions and also the crumpling in where all these bodies become one. These are very, very, like this is done in the world of contemporary dance over and over again, but I thought, you know, this is something to maybe explore anew with these weird suits. So we're doing this in the middle of summer. It's super hot. I make these people wear these like quarter-inch thick plastic suits, and everyone's just pouring sweat. So we have popsicle breaks all the time. Because I filmed it on a green screen background, I could like take the body out of where I was filming and then recompose it as I saw fit. So if we're talking about like the way a choreographer choreographs bodies on a stage, there was that was happening on camera. But then in the editing procedure, I can choreograph the bodies in the space of the video as well, and that was like a really like mind blowing for me. It was just having that control, that kind of extra layer added to it. So you can come up with weird compositions like this. And we'll see that play out in the video. Yeah. So, kind of a weird line, but like I kind of have this idea of like treating the body like an email or something. You can, you know, multiply it, send it out to a lot of different sources. You can cut it up, cut and paste certain parts of it. Or just treating the body like, because it's become digitized, right? And there's all these things that we do to digital media. So I'm just trying to play with that aesthetic. This is a bit long, a video, but I haven't shown it in an exhibition yet, so I like to show basically the work in its entirety, and we can maybe talk about it after and what you guys how you responded to it. So it's 5 minutes long. Oh no, we've lost sound. Okay, tech support. I think I just kind of jostled the cable, maybe.
Oh.
Turn it on. Turn it on. Try it.
Oh, nice. Nice. Oh, yeah. Thanks. Okay, so there's that playing out. Okay, so then I'll just finish. I'm doing pretty good for time, right? Yeah. Okay, so this is kind of leading into the project I did at Whippersnapper Gallery, the thing you guys can all go see if you make your way downtown to Toronto. Whippersnapper is on Dundas West, right at the entrance to Kensington Market, in between Kensington Street and Augusta. Like Louise said, open from Thursday, Friday, Saturday from 1 to 7. And yeah. So essentially, just as my thinking is progressing, I'm thinking, well, I've kind of taken that performance as far as I can take it at the current moment, but I'm interested in this machine as an entity in itself without even the human as an activation point. And the idea of automation, and we're talking about the change in our kind of labor structure in North America, as jobs are being exported elsewhere, but also jobs that were being exported, they're also disappearing because they can be replaced by machines, and kind of like across a lot of industries. And so I'm thinking of a lot of these ideas. I'm thinking about networks. I'm thinking about, yeah, I guess we can talk a bit about that after. So yeah, so let's just talk about what's going on. I've got 20 motors in these boxes that are all controlled via a central kind of computer that controls all those guys. So each of those rotates individually, which pulls and pumps the accordions. You guys are used to that kind of mechanic by now. And it kind of carries out this musical composition that I worked on again with the same musician friend as before. And I'll play the video and then I'll kind of unpack it a little bit. So that's a bit closer up. Kind of starting to refine my aesthetic a little bit. It's kind of like, it's hard to explain, maybe I'm over-explaining it a little bit, but I think it comes from, like my background as a Danish immigrant, and this idea of Scandinavian design is a very clean, untreated wood surfaces. Everything is nicely sanded, a lot of round corners. And that's the kind of environment I grew up in, and also the family environment that I lived in, because we brought over all this furniture and all this stuff and all these old toys. But then again, we moved to Saskatoon. I grew up there for about 20 years in like stark suburbia, where the idea of repetition is always apparent, always in your field of view. So that also is like always playing out. But then living in Toronto for a number of years, you can kind of see the ad hoc structure, the way the city is laid out. It's a bit of a lack of money, a little bit of poor planning, but this city is a bit chaotic in a beautiful way. Yeah. So maybe that's playing out in the wiring system. Yeah. So that's a close-up of the kind of crank system. And just a short video here. This is in my studio. This is kind of like an example of what it could do, but it does so many more things if you go see it at Whippersnapper. So many more surprises. Okay, let's go back to an image of it. Yeah. Okay, so just to kind of unpack that a little bit, the kind of kernel for this idea, I think I'm trying to make the robot, the machine, kind of an entity on itself, and knowing that my programming knowledge is limited, and even in the best programming in the world, we can only kind of start to graze this idea of artificial intelligence. So I can only kind of graze the very basic components for life. So I'm looking at things that relate to architecture that are organic as well as very simple. So I kind of hit on this idea of mold or moss or lichen, something that grows on the surfaces of architecture. Interested in this idea of site-adjusted work, something that can go into any space potentially. You can kind of see like there's a plan that's all kind of improvised, and the Whippersnapper has its own variation of this. And I'm really excited to like install it, 5 or 6 different places and like wrap it around a corner, down a hallway, up a huge wall, or just different things, and organize the notes in different ways and create different emotional spaces with the work. Yeah, and this idea of an emotional space I think is really interesting, and kind of how we're manipulated by, the way the Western music system is used in like if the way it plays out in movies, or even just in a regular piece of music. Sad notes make you sad, happy notes make you happy, right? And just like playing in this world, right? Because you can't quite get away from it when I use. So these are all parts from the accordion, the reeds from an accordion. So I'm locked into A, B, C, D, E sharp, whatever. So the way I kind of structured that is to kind of have different walls emanating different emotions, essentially. So in Whippersnapper, this one too, I think there's like a happy wall and a sad wall and a dark pocket over here. And the ceiling is kind of the low notes, so you're kind of always kind of like, like something dark above you. I just, there's no real purpose for it. I'm just trying to hit the viewer in the gut. I just want you to be trapped in there and to feel something. You can feel whatever you want, but you have to feel something. Yeah. So that's it for my work. I think I've got 5 minutes to tell you a story. I've been dying to tell this story because I want to talk about where my work is headed, and I really want to practice telling this story, and it's totally true, and it's crazy. Okay, so this idea of the object as, or the machine as an entity in itself, simple machine, and then work in this go. I was packing up, I had a studio in Toronto, and I was packing up all my things to go to Banff. So I got this crate, a big plastic crate, and I stuffed it full of my tools and some half-built sculptures and a lot of heavy metals and stuff. And I put it together and I bolted it shut. It was about this big, really just gray, kind of looked like nothing. And I'm lugging it from my studio to my apartment, and it's like a 10-minute walk, right? And I only get halfway, and it's just like unbearably heavy, and my back's about to give out. So I just put it on the sidewalk, and I go home because I know my roommate's home. And then he's just, we'll just run there, we'll run back, and we'll bring it back to the apartment, and I can get rid of it. So I grab my roommate, we come back, and it's gone. And I'm looking around, I'm like, where the hell's my case? And I'm like, oh no, I've lost it. All my stuff that's not that valuable. But it's been moved to a field, it was a playground of a high school, so right into the middle of the field. And we're like, whoa, this is so weird. Like someone's really messing us. I think it's really hilarious. So we tramp through. I think there's snow. Anyway, so we both get on either side of this thing, and then we start lugging it. And this person just runs out of this house, just bolts. She's a woman. She's really well built, shaved head, and she's really angry. She's yelling at us to stay in place. And she tells us the bomb squad is coming. Yeah. And I'm like, so I'm scared because this woman is enormous and could crush me. And as we're waiting there, I don't get the explanation till later, right? Because she thinks that we are insurgents or something. Yeah, and so it happens that I placed that package next to kind of an MP of Toronto's house, who was in the middle of this kind of tense political situation, and a lot of hate mail was coming her way. And she was actually being guarded by the Canadian military at the time. So that was this woman who's coming out to grab us. So I have to like open this case in front of them. Like the bomb squad comes, and they're kind of looking over my shoulder, and I open it up, and it's just like a bunch of like bolts and nuts. Anyway, so that plays out. This happened maybe 3 years ago. And I'm just really starting to think about it again as like this object, this thing was like so threatening. And it was just like this idea of the threatening object, not because that it actually is, but because it's a source of the unknown or mystery. And I just kind of want to play with that emotion and then use kinetic sculpture in a way that activates that object to become threatening. Maybe opening up a dialogue about that kind of thing, the idea of the unattended baggage. Not trying to place any blame on anyone for causing that fear, but just reflecting on our own suspicion of that fear. That's it. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
I'm just wondering, with the, like, are you programming it to make the music, or does the machine play itself? Because I find it like the machine's playing itself, that's frightening, because it's like, oh, like now this is making music, not you. You're not programming it to make that.
Right. I would love it if it made music. I guess it's always going to have to come from programming, that someone would have to program. I try to introduce a bit of randomness.
Yeah.
To say, I could describe it as like I've programmed kind of like these musical sentences, and there might be a 20 to choose from in the programming.
Oh, okay.
And then the computer's like, okay, I'm going to play 5 of these, and it selects 5 sentences and puts them together into like a 1.5-minute performance. So there's a bit of the computer figuring its own self out, and then a bit of my my kind of composition over top. Yeah, I would love to kind of get into that really intense programming. Like you have to probably like go to Google to do like the idea of like mapping and these kind of generative sound systems and studying music like that. I just don't have that skill.
So when it's turning, that's like when this one's turning this way and this one's turning another way, that's your program?
Yeah.
Making it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But your idea is better.
How did the composer work with can you say that you worked with the composer?
Yeah.
So did you give him, did you do some parts of it first, and then he made up a composition to go with what or did he just give you his composition and you have to figure it out?
Well, there's actually like a lot of lessons, and like I wasn't, I didn't want to just like have this person come in and just compose it and give me a thing. So I asked her to teach me, and we kind of went through a bit of the musical canon. She teaches violin. And I think the most creative aspect of that was that we made these kind of cards. It was kind of like imagine like a cutout triangle with 3 notes for a chord, and she would play those, and we would talk about the emotional space of that note. So then we made 50 of these cards. I really should have a slide of that. That's a good question. And then we kind of used those triangles to make a map of how 2 chords could go together. Because if you look at the way it is, like that's 3 notes and that's 3 notes, but they share a note in common. So you have to kind of compose the space of interlocking notes, essentially. So it was a little bit of both. At one point, she handed me a sheet of paper that was the whole thing composed, and then I went back. I think we did that swapping 2 or 3 times to kind of both be satisfied. Yeah. It's fun. Yeah.
This piece in particular, which I saw, reminded me a little bit of Marshall McLuhan, in as much as McLuhan's thing was artists take technologies that are no longer functional, and at that point, artists are able to do something new with them. But they best work with stale-dated technology. And it's interesting, these white dryer tubes are now illegal in Ontario. I know they still sell them.
Across Canada, yeah.
But when I saw it, I thought more of kind of the turn of the century, like the Valley Maker or and I think this is your most successful musical piece as well. It's a little bit like watching an orchestra, where you were able to see where the various parts of the orchestra function, how the musicians make the sounds that they make. That's part of going to see classical music. Yeah, so it was a very captivating piece. But it's funny, you talk about architecture and the contemporary city, but I really saw this as a musical apparatus, above all else. And, just look at how music's made. But do you see that, do you see your work going, maybe not if you're going to be exploding pieces.
Yeah.
Do you see, you can go in so many ways, but this idea of, a specific musical direction is different from a more choreographic direction.
Yeah.
So I just wondered what, are you now becoming, interested in the idea of a piece of music? Like, did you record this and just listen to it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess there's like the McLuhan part and then the where is this going. I'll just start with the where is this going. I think right now I'm interested in fracturing the practice and going the musical route. So I'm working with this composer on a collaborative kind of more performance-y gig. Like we're gonna perform after a band in Saskatoon. We're gonna try that out, just to enter that world and become very musical with that. It's hard to maintain criticality when you're using music in a contemporary art world. So I'm hesitant, or I'm scared to go down that path too much.
John Page did okay then.
Yeah, but that was a different time, and I think that was experimental and maybe more exciting back then. The idea of McLuhan, I can't really I think it's a good point. The accordion also has a lot of history. Like every culture seems to have, 200 years ago, the accordion seemed to find some sort of place within that, or before, like Italian, French, the Cajuns, the Acadians. It just plays out. It's really interesting, and it has that kind of weak sound, like weak vibration sound that harkens back to something older. And I think people have forgotten about the accordion in general. I would just say like that idea is I can just better talk about it when the idea of the green screen, right? Like, so Hollywood has been using green screen for so long, and I think now is the time where we can just take that away from them and just use it so much better. It's superhero crap, but just like, we can do different things. Anyway, yeah.
How do you make the jar chord make the right note? Is there something you have to tune?
Yeah, so all that's been done ahead of time, because it's like if you pop open an accordion, it has it's called a reed bank. So like maybe 20 in a set of little metal tabs, and you can just pop them out, and then you have a little tab that you can mount. I mounted them at the end caps, and that takes care of that. When the wind passes through that, that makes the note.
Have you considered maybe showing this work in like an abandoned church, sort of the idea of organ playing and all these emotions that you were talking about? I think it would kind of be interesting to see this work played in like a different setting, like outside of a gallery setting.
Absolutely, yeah.
Maybe an abandoned church. That would be kind of interesting to see.
Yeah. I think the idea of different spaces having different acoustic properties, I think, is really interesting. And a church would be great. Maybe there's a way I can figure out how to not, because like it's a weak installation, and plus I'm popping holes in something like walls, but it's a good idea. Yeah, I think it could play out really nicely on the floor. If I could find a way to do that. Yeah, but there's all sorts of weird things, like the channel underneath a street, right? Like some of those subway terminals in Toronto could be amazing too. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks.